Boa tarde a todos. Bem-vindo ao nosso webinar sobre as 5 diretrizes para uma gestão sustentável da capacidade hospitalar durante a crise do Covid-19. Agradeço a todos vocês que, mesmo com agendas bastante sobrecarregadas, em função de tudo isso que estamos passando, aceitaram o nosso convite para esta importante conversa com a Johnson & Johnson Device está trazendo, junto com os nossos parceiros Advisory Board e Distrito. Meu nome é Fabrício Campolina, sou líder de Healthcare Transformation da Johnson & Johnson Medical Devices e vou mediar a nossa conversa no dia de hoje. Próximo, por favor. A nossa agenda terá a introdução do Gustavo Galá, que é o presidente da Johnson & Johnson Medical Devices no Brasil. Em seguida, teremos a apresentação do Daniel Della Ferreira, do Advisory Board, falando sobre todos esses pontos que nós destacamos anteriormente. E, finalmente, iremos ter espaço para perguntas que poderão ser feitas via chat ao longo de toda a apresentação. Próximo, por favor. Eu gostaria de convidar a todos a escanear o QR Code que aparece na tela, para que vocês possam, através deles, baixar os materiais que a gente vai estar apresentando no dia de hoje e também enviar as suas perguntas. Para escanear o QR Code, basta você apontar a câmera do seu celular para a tela que você poderá ter acesso às informações que eu acabei de descrever. Então, vamos lá. Gostaria de passar a palavra para o Gustavo Galá, presidente da Johnson & Johnson Medical Brasil. Gustavo, boa tarde.
Boa tarde, obrigado, Fabrício. Boa tarde a todos. É um prazer estar aqui virtualmente com todos vocês. Como vocês vão perceber, meu português é todavía work in process, ¿ok? Hoy es 7 de abril y cuando se conmemora el Día Mundial de la Salud. Estamos vivenciando una de las mayores crisis de la historia, con un número creciente de infectados no mundo, na Latinoamérica, aquí no Brasil. El desafío que el COVID representa es tan grande que es problema de todos. Precisamos unir las fortalezas de cada uno para lidiar con esa situación y superarla. Na Johnson & Johnson somos guiados pelo nosso credo e não poderia ser diferente agora. E com base nele, no nosso compromisso com médicos, profissionais da saúde, pacientes em nossas comunidades, que junto com nossos parceiros, nesta ocasião, Advisory Board, Distrito, organizamos essa importante conversa sobre dos principais gargalos com que o sistema de saúde vem lidiando no mundo inteiro durante esta crise de Covid. Agora tenho o prazer de apresentá-lo a Daniel Della Ferreira, Senior Director de Advisory Board. Daniel.
Hello, my name is Daniel Della Ferreira, and I'm a Senior Research Director with the Advisory Board Company in Washington, D.C. The first thing I want to do is to thank you. We know how extremely busy healthcare executives and clinical teams are due to the COVID-19 crisis. And we appreciate the fact that you're taking an hour of your time to actually spend that time with us. And I know that we're going to be sending you back to teams that need your help and to urgent situations in your respective organizations. Because of how busy you are and how valuable and scarce your time is, we want to give you a clear return on that investment of time that you're making with us. In order to make that return quantifiable and evident, basically, I want to show you our plan for the next 30 minutes. I need to make that clear. We're going to start essentially with a quick overview of the context of COVID-19 as a global crisis without dwelling on it too much. First of all, because it's changing really, really quickly, and any information we share with you might become outdated and obsolete within a matter of days. Secondly, because we don't need to belabor the point that this is a difficult situation. You're actually living that day in and day out within your respective organizations. Instead, essentially, we want to spend most of our time on prescriptive solutions based on pre-existing best practices that we profile at the advisory board long before the COVID-19 crisis came into existence. And we handpicked those practices because we think they are the most adaptable and adoptable to the current crisis that you're experiencing. Now, this calls for a need for prioritization, first and foremost, essentially. And as you can see, we've taken a less is more approach. This is by no means a comprehensive list. There's plenty other things that you should consider when thinking about COVID. However, we selected the 5 that you see on screen. We handpicked these because these are the areas that we feel are most likely to suffer an immediate impact. So we're going to talk about virtual care and telemedicine. We're going to talk about protecting resources so that when patients come to your physical sites of care, you know exactly how to allocate those scarce resources. We're going to talk about figuring out where your bottlenecks are most likely to come and how to unplug them. And then we're going to finish with the human factor. But before we do that, basically, let's quickly assess the context, as I mentioned before. This is, of course, a fast-moving crisis, as shown for the fact that the information that I have on this slide is probably already updated to an extent. This is something that is still changing day to day, hour to hour, forcing very quick and often contradictory responses from policymakers, providers, the media, and of course, the general population. Now, in view of that, essentially, we also have to acknowledge that this is a global crisis. Last count, as of April 2nd, the last day for which we have published data, we had detected cases of COVID-19 in more than 170 countries, virtually the totality of the world. Now, we have seen a wide diversity of responses, and those diverse responses and the effects, the results they generate, give us a real-life case study that is unfolding in front of our very eyes, and that we shouldn't forget after this crisis ends. This is a learning opportunity for us all in that sense. Now, one of the key elements that we need to absorb when looking at it from the perspective of acute care providers, hospitals, and similar organizations translates into a very clear lesson. And the lesson is that there isn't a single healthcare system worldwide ready for the demand explosion represented by COVID-19. The breaking points do and will continue to differ country to country, but it is advisable and responsible to acknowledge that every single health system worldwide, regardless of whether it's a developing country or a developed country, regardless of how the system might be funded, will experience some sort of crisis, collapse, or breaking point. The second lesson that we can also learn is that there isn't a single strategy that can be considered a silver bullet. No single strategy, no single approach will suffice to solve a problem of this magnitude. Though early responses will always expand your range of options, you want to be as quickly in reacting as possible. Basically, they're not a guarantee that you can become complacent and follow the laurels later on. Look at the examples worldwide and compare and contrast between them. Taiwan and Germany's basically are being lauded right now because their quick acknowledgement, their early acknowledgement that this was indeed a crisis probably bought them vital time for acute providers. On the other hand, though, you notice that in the case of Great Britain, the UK dragging its feet and wasting extremely valuable time early in the onset of the crisis put a very overcrowded hospital infrastructure under even more stress and more pressure. So that's it in terms of the diagnostic. This is something you're going to revisit as new information becomes available. But let's move from the part that is most valuable and more to the part that is more valuable and more applicable. Let's move from diagnosis to treatment, basically organized in the 5 tips that I mentioned before. The first tip is actually the answer to a question. How do we continue providing care of the same quality with equal commitment to our patients and their safety when meeting those patients in person is in and of itself a risk, essentially? In order to answer that question, I want to introduce you first to a mental model that we came up with. This is a mental model that we created when we wrote our patient flow study in 2020. It is always relevant. We believe it's an evergreen in that regard, but it's now vital to explore the alternatives that you see alongside this line. We thought of them as safe off-ramps on a highway. That's our analogy. And those safe off-ramps would detour our patients away from the acute care side into an alternative and sometimes a better care destination. Now, I want to show you the first off-ramp first and foremost, which consists of the alternative of telemedicine and virtual care. And we specify here that we have 3 different ways in which we can actually use that tool. On the left-hand side, the idea is that of an acute-based provider, a specialist based in the hospital, for example, supporting a primary care provider. So provider-to-provider support enabled by virtual care. The second one in the center of the slide is direct virtual care or telemedicine from provider to patients in real time. And the last one on the right-hand side of the slide is asynchronous care, in which the interaction between the provider and the patient don't necessarily occur in real time. Now, I want to show you one example of each, starting with the provider-to-provider option. And our example comes from one of our members in Canada. This is Providence Health in British Columbia, the west coast of Canada. And one of the things that I want to emphasize is that this practice, even though counts as virtual care and telemedicine, actually depends on 20th century technology, not on 21st century technology. As you can see on the slide, Providence enables RACE, which stands for Rapid Access to Consultative Expertise, through a phone hotline. And I emphasize that point because having in place something that works now, that works immediately, is actually better than falling in love with the latest and newest and coolest app. As you can see, RACE amounts to a hospital-based specialist supporting GPs, supporting general practitioners in the community. They started in pilot mode, devised or designed specifically for cardiovascular patients, but now they're doing it for more than 20 specialties, essentially. And as you can see, the negligible cost that made it accessible even for a publicly financed health system such as British Columbia and Canada. They also saw an immediate ROI translated into savings and cost reductions to provide care. I won't belabor on the implementation details because we have a time limit here today, but for those of you interested in deploying something similar, in adapting this to the needs of your own patient populations and your own organizations, please don't hesitate to contact us. There are plenty of additional details available if you're interested in doing something like that. The second option that I want to show you basically shifts the focus, and it's from provider directly to patient. And this one does move from 20th to 21st century technology. We have seen countless examples of members organizations, hospitals worldwide, using Skype, Zoom, or similar platforms in real time, essentially, for the options that you see on the left-hand side and on the center of the slide. And the only thing that changes between those two is whether you are a primary care provider or an acute care provider in that sense. The caveat, the one thing that we need to keep an eye on in that regard, is that how you choose to deploy these things will depend on the regulatory framework of the country in which you are in your base. But quite frankly, this is a time of crisis. There is no better moment in time to try different things, to try new things, and to decrease the risk aversion that the healthcare sector has historically had against new technologies. Now, regarding the third option, which you see on the right-hand side of the slide, that one actually adds artificial intelligence as a tool that magnifies the capabilities of your clinical teams. And I want to show you one example right here. You notice, by looking at this slide, that the way in which the tactic is designed shows that artificial intelligence, AI algorithms, support but do not replace the clinical and critical judgment that only a highly trained clinician can exercise. The AI platform will gather data, will process data, but the idea is not that it will make any decisions, but instead, it will save all of the time the human provider would have spent gathering and processing data in order to allow them to reuse that time to actually care for more patients. Given the constraints that we know we're going to have in terms of human capacity, this is crucial. The most widely publicized example of this is the result of the partnership between Amazon's Alexa platform, the Echo platform, and Brigham and Women's Children in Boston in the U.S. Basically, Brigham and Women established an agreement with Amazon that allowed them to upload their pediatric ED triage algorithm into the Alexa platform. So whereas before the existence of this agreement, a parent basically unsure of the severity of his or her child's condition would have straight driven up that kid to the emergency department. Right now, that parent has an option of interacting with Alexa, sharing the symptoms and other characteristics of the child, and Alexa will inform the parent whether taking the kid to the ED is the right course of action, or monitoring him at home and maintaining the child hydrated is the right course of action, or maybe setting an appointment with a primary care provider because it's a clear medical need, but not an urgent need. Feel free to color outside the lines in that regard. You're not expected to replicate exactly what Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston is doing. Instead, basically, think of it as the key principles on which you can base your own strategy. I want to show you the next example, basically, because we need to acknowledge that some of our patients won't be treatable virtually. So our second safe off-ramp allows us to prevent avoidable emergency department presentations. Now, emergency departments have become the default destination for most of our patients, even before COVID-19 came into the picture. That's always suboptimal, but it's now completely unacceptable in view of the pandemic. Basically, at the same time, as you can see with this example from one of our members in the UK, overcrowded EDs and overcrowded hospitals often coexist with an inefficient use of ambulatory or outpatient capacity. The solution to the problem entails switching the default, turning the exception into the rule, and vice versa, turning the rule into the exception. But how do we do this? This is an example from Pennine Acute Care Trust in the UK. They tried many times before to switch that default, but they realized that every time you have a very long list of criteria for determining which patients should be treated in ambulatory care mode, the list itself is comprehensive and thorough and beautiful, but it is never read, never used, never applied by an extremely busy emergency department clinician. So the solution is to simplify. As you can see here, they turned their inclusion list into an exclusion list, and that is significantly better. This is a one-page document that clearly states, unless you meet the conditions in black print, you are an ambulatory patient, you are an outpatient. Essentially, Pennine turned the right thing to do and the easiest thing to do into one and the same. Implementing this successfully will require vigilance and enforcement, of course, to guarantee adherence, compliance with the new standard, and also to prevent backsliding into old habits. It will also require resource reallocation. Historically, we have maintained or preserved or protected our decision-making power, our resolutive power, for those patients that make it through a number of filters and thresholds within the hospital. Pennine moves that resolutive capability a lot closer to their front door to make those decisions better. This is not easy. It is very difficult, and it's counterintuitive to implement a practice like this one. But the results that you can see on that slide justify the effort every single day, even before the crisis. And it's particularly crucial to try this approach if COVID-19 is collapsing your emergency departments. And of course, just like with the previous practice, if you're interested in additional implementation details, please don't hesitate to contact us. Next, Even if we do virtual care, telemedicine, and detouring correctly, we have to acknowledge that some patients will have to be treated in the emergency department. So the key question here is how we differentiate pathways within the ED that align with the different needs that every patient type will bring with them when they present to us. Because we're going to have a hybrid patient inflow. We're going to have the coexistence of COVID-19 and non-COVID-19 patients in the same ED at the same time. How do you make sure that we allocate resources adequately? And probably most importantly, and most crucially, how do we make sure that our emergency department does not become a COVID-19 contagion vector? I want to show you one example. It comes from one of our members in Washington State, in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, essentially. And as you can see here, the key principle, the active ingredient of the practice, is the assessment of both the severity and the resources most likely to be consumed by every single patient type that arrives. And on the basis of that pre-assessment, the allocation of resources in a manner that accords the volume and the capability of the organization. You notice here, as you read these three boxes from the left to the right-hand side of the slide, that both the numerical or volumetric resource allocation increases left to right, the teams get bigger as you go to the right, and also the composition of those teams changes as well. So you have a top-of-license principle applied across these three categories, which most of the highly specialized talent doctors on the right-hand side of the slide, and with teams that work at top of license or top of scope on the left and the center of the slide. There are a couple of additional demographic and statistical details on this slide for those of you interested in looking at those details on your own time. However, just like with the practices before, there's a couple of prerequisites to be satisfied for this to work, right? We have listed here some of the key or some of the main operational requirements that you absolutely need to have in place if you want to launch something like this. The good news is that in exchange for that, we get not just a more efficient and a safer emergency department, but we get to protect a resource that is always scarce, acute care beds, essentially, but even more so now in view of the crisis. And we do so by sending an extremely clear, incontrovertible message that the expectation for treatment as a plan is ambulatory or to be developed in outpatient mode. And this is, of course, confirmed by the results that you see on this slide. Otherwise, we couldn't claim this is a best practice. Now, for those of you interested in replicating this brief checklist, in replicating this practice, we included this brief checklist of possible adaptations. As with the practices before, there is more information available. Please don't hesitate to contact us if you want a Q&A session on how to create your own version of this tactic. Now, the options we have discussed so far should decrease our volume of avoidable admissions. But we need to talk now about caring for those patients whom we are rightfully, correctly admitting into acute care beds, for those patients for whom the correct course of action is actually hospitalization. Now, the key here, essentially, once we acknowledge that a patient needs an acute care bed, is to become much better, much more thorough at scrutinizing the value of every day, every hour, every minute those patients spend hospitalized with us, and to ask significantly tougher questions as to which of our care activities developed while the patient is hospitalized actually require the use of an acute care bed. This example comes from Bradford Teaching Hospital, one of our members in the UK, under the umbrella of the NHS. And the team at Bradford realized that much of their length of stay was actually linked to testing and diagnostics. And then they realized, as you can see, when you transition from the left to the right-hand side of the slide, that diagnostic didn't make hospitalization necessary during every single day, essentially. Much of that testing and diagnostic analysis could be done in ambulatory mode instead. So the patients were released significantly earlier and treated during that ambulatory patient in outpatient mode. Breaking that old habits of having captive patients, of keeping them in our beds without their clothes, without their shoes, was not easy for Bradford, basically. This was a deeply ingrained, deeply rooted habit. But the operational gains that you see at the bottom of the slide were extremely significant. And the good news, as you can see on the last indicator, on the bottom right-hand side of the slide, that they were able to perceive those operational gains without decreasing care quality, without decreasing patient safety, without negatively affecting patient satisfaction. Similarly, Bradford is not the only example. Discharge to assess models have been yielding comparable benefits across an extremely wide variety of countries and health systems. And the good news is that we do have to share with you 3 successful examples of implementation in Latin America. Now, this is an extremely robust practice, as proven by the fact that it works regardless of your physical location, regardless of how your healthcare system is financed. This is something that travels really well. It's extremely adaptable. So if you're interested in trying this approach, please feel free to contact us for more details and for a detailed discussion of how it works. This is, in a way, the gift that keeps on giving, if you will. Incrementally, once you implement that correctly, this idea of moving historically inpatient care models to the ambulatory setting could double as a mechanism that allows chronic patients to self-care better. Of course, this will require, as you can see in this example, that comes from Ipswich Hospital, also in the UK. This would require incremental training on the part of those patients or their home carers. But the fact of the matter is, even after the COVID crisis passes, we're going to see an increasing chronic multimorbid patient population for whom the only sustainable alternative in the long term is enabling their self-care. So we'd encourage you to think from the same perspective that Ipswich took. And of course, basically, in order to reinforce this point, we have results at the bottom of the slide that show you the financial, the operational, and the human impact of this. Now, you've noticed essentially that so far, we have talked mostly about operational capacity, about physical capacity. Our view of healthcare as tackled or affected by COVID-19 has been that of a machine, of an industrial model. We have to acknowledge now the human side. Specifically, within the human side, we have to acknowledge our clinical teams. And we start with an assessment of the situation. On the left-hand side, you see that even before the crisis exploded, life was already extremely stressful. Before COVID-19, there were no doctors and no nurses that had an easy or complacent life in that sense. To that already difficult situation, we have now to add the stress factors that you see on the right-hand side of the slide. The key question here is how we support those clinical teams as they manage this burden that was already sizable and now has increased exponentially as a result of the pandemic. Our first recommendation in that regard is based on the concept of clarity, essentially. And we have written that down or subdivided it into the 4 recommendations that you see here. First, on the left-hand side of the slide, make sure that you have one consistent source of information. Having one messenger gets you half of the way there in the guarantee of having a consistent, internally logical message. Lesson number 2, frequency. There is a value, particularly during these difficult times, these times of high anxiety, there is a value in the predictability of a routine. We look forward to going back to a boring version of our lives. So the idea of communicating once a day at the same time, even if you don't have much to communicate, will actually decrease the uncertainty of our teams. Third, keep the message simple. Keeping messages short and simple and straightforward is the best way to show the fact that we respect how valuable our team's time is and how little of that time they have. So don't force them to read 3-page emails, long memos, technical language. Go to the point, show them that you respect the very little amount of time they have and that you expect to use a tiny bit of that to read your communications. And last but not least, on the right-hand side of the slide, make it as easy as possible for them to re-access those messages. Archive them so they can go back and remember. Our next recommendation on the human front, essentially, is that the channels that you use to communicate are as important as the content of the message itself. Use those channels to indicate how you prioritize your internal communications. The channel used should give a very clear idea of what's more or less important. Next, get ahead of rumors, detect them early, clarify them proactively, respond to them before they grow. The sooner you can diffuse a rumor, the least damage it will do to the mental and the emotional health of your organizations. And whenever possible, use the communications that we saw in the preceding two slides, the ones that are periodical and predictable and come from a trusted source, basically, to respond to those rumors. Use the power of scale to counter those. Next, essentially, be visible. Leadership hinges on visibility. In that case, you want to be as visible, as present as a leader as possible. And you want to make it as easy, as frictionless as possible for your teams to approach you in that regard. Your virtual door, because we're talking about an environment within which social distancing is crucial, your virtual door has to be open. And as you can see, basically, we're presenting a virtual door on the left-hand side of the slide and a virtual window, if you will, on the center of the slide. It should be something that overlaps and compatibilizes with a very difficult workflow your clinical teams are dealing with, and also compatibilizes with the fact that they should be able to do that without interrupting their patient care activities. Last but not least, this is arguably one of the most important things we can recommend, and also one of the things that's probably most easily done, most frictionlessly done in that sense. Recognize the excellence, recognize the commitment to care that your teams will absolutely prove to you that they have during this crisis. Every single piece of good news that we have received from members worldwide during the last few weeks, and good news are extremely welcome, because most of the news that we get are not good. Every piece of good news that we have received over the past few weeks are examples that could be rightfully classified as heroic on the part of clinical teams. Make sure that it's well known. Acknowledge their commitment, their engagement, their dedication to patients and to your organization as publicly as possible. Because if you do it that way, first, you set a standard for every other member of your team. And second, you ensure that standard can be imitated by everybody else. So don't be afraid to congratulate. Don't be afraid to recognize as often as possible. With that, essentially, I have to acknowledge that we have covered a lot of content in a rather limited amount of time. I want to thank you for staying with us, and I look forward to engaging with you during the question.
Boa tarde, pessoal. Espero que vocês tenham aproveitado bastante a palestra do Dan. Dan, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. It was very, very interesting. Eu vou moderar agora uma sessão de perguntas e respostas em português, e aí vou traduzir as perguntas para o Dan e vice-versa, para que todos possam participar. Gostaria de aproveitar para relembrar o que eu falei no início e dizer para aqueles que se conectaram depois, por favor, escaneie esse QR Code que aparece na tela, que ele dará a vocês acesso aos materiais que o Dan apresentou agora e também a oportunidade de fazer perguntas. Próximo, por favor. Agora a gente vai iniciar a nossa sessão de perguntas e respostas. Para essa sessão teremos a presença, além do Daniel de la Ferreira, que é o Senior Research Director do Advisory Board, também o Alexandre Luque, que é o nosso diretor comercial da Johnson Johnson Medical Brasil, a Bruna Kutrup, que é a gerente Brasil de Soluções Estratégicas, e o Nicolas Ferreira, que é o nosso analista de soluções estratégicas no Brasil. Eu gostaria de começar com uma pergunta para o Dan, que é relacionada a essa mudança de paradigma que estamos vivendo na medicina atual para uma prática digital e como que isso impacta em termos de qualidade, segurança e satisfação de clientes e também os custos hospitalares. Eu vou fazer a pergunta em inglês para ele. Dan, can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear, Fabio.
Okay, great. So the first question that we have here that we received from Hospital Mater Dei, Luis Marcio, is regarding the shift in paradigm that we're living in our medical practice for a more digital practice. Mm-hmm. So in terms of quality and safety and satisfaction of customers, and as well as hospital costs, how this shift will impact hospitals and health plans?
Thank you, Fabrizio. That's a very good question. And we have been hearing versions of that question from our members all over the world. This is not exclusive to Latin America or to Brazil. In our view at the advisory board, one of the things that we have neglected to do in healthcare, the one thing that separates healthcare from most other industries, is we hardly ever ask the patient, the consumer, what it is that they prefer. And if you think about examples from other industries, you notice that those providers that lost sight of consumer preferences were essentially eliminated from their own markets, from a competitor or from a new entrant who is a disruptor. We tend to assume in healthcare that we already know and that we know better than patients what they want and what they need. A couple of years ago, we actually sent out a survey, and the survey was sent to two different populations of respondents: patients, consumers, and healthcare executives. And we asked them both to value, through a forced prioritization exercise, a number of features of a potential healthcare provider. Now, interestingly enough, most of the healthcare executives that answered the questionnaire told us that patients value the things that historically have been provided by them to them by hospitals. Essentially, they want to know who their doctor is, and they want a reliable organization behind the provision of healthcare. The responses from the patients, the responses from the consumers were completely different. They valued ease of access and ease of utilization. They wanted virtual platforms. They wanted phone triage and phone-powered follow-up. They wanted access after 5 p.m., which virtual makes a lot happier and easier than presential. They wanted automated scheduling and so on and so forth. We have seen up until this point in time no indication whatsoever that moving to a virtually assisted model decreases patient satisfaction, decreases safety, decreases care quality. The reasons that many organizations have used not to try this, even before COVID-19 became a factor, have a lot more to do with the clinician's comfort zone and a lot less to do with patient safety. I believe that we're using patient safety to an extent as an excuse not to try new things. Think about the way in which you used to do banking, personal banking, 10 years ago. You had to go to the branch, period, end of story. Now you do your banking using your smartphone with an app. You do your banking online, essentially. And quite frankly, you're probably as satisfied, as happy, if not happier with your bank now than you were 5 or 10 years ago. The same thing, a version of the same thing, can happen and should happen in healthcare. And if providers don't take the lead in making this change, they're going to be on the receiving end. If they remain passive and don't initiate this new modality of care, insurance companies are going to do it to them, essentially, because the cost differential is quite significant. Basically, you have guaranteed savings every time you launch a virtual care mode. And insurance companies are a lot more finely tuned with that financial factor than providers are, right? So this is the time for the hospital to actually start that conversation, because otherwise they're going to be passive recipients of something that will not be optimal to them and will not be optimal for the patients.
Thanks, Dan. Então, acho que o Dan colocou de uma maneira muito clara que, usualmente, dentro do sistema de saúde, a gente não tem o costume de realmente ouvir o que interessa ao consumidor final, ao paciente, e muitas vezes trabalhamos com premissas às quais a gente está acostumado. E ele citou um estudo em que as percepções que os profissionais de saúde tinham sobre o que interessava aos consumidores pacientes eram bastante distintas daquelas que os próprios consumidores tinham, segundo a pesquisa. E os consumidores, o que eles pediam era a automatização das tarefas, poder ter acesso a serviço depois das 5 horas da tarde, poder fazer agendamento online das suas consultas, e que muitas vezes os hospitais não vão por este caminho porque ficam dentro da sua zona de conforto. E ele recordou a evolução que o sistema bancário passou nos últimos 10 anos, para citar que o sistema hospitalar vai numa mesma direção, e, finalmente, disse que se os hospitais não tomarem a liderança de fazer a virtualização, né, do cuidado de saúde, outros atores irão tomar essa iniciativa e os hospitais terão que se adaptar em breve a essa nova forma de servir. Então, né, muito obrigado, Dan. A outra pergunta que veio da Lília Natal, na comunidade de startups de inovação, é: o que o Brasil deve fazer hoje para não ter um colapso na saúde com o impacto da Covid-19? So, Dan, another question for you. What Brazil needs to do today to avoid a collapse in our healthcare system due to COVID-19?
We think that in a critical situation, like the situation caused by a pandemic, you need to think of your health infrastructure, your healthcare system, as a series of concentric circles of defense. Historically, in Latin America, people have defaulted to the hospital, essentially, as the one place where they receive care. Because we had a degree of idle capacity, because hospitals have more resolutive capabilities than outpatient providers like urgent care clinics and GPs' offices for outpatients or ambulatory patients, right? We can't afford to do that. Our hospitals will be occupied to 100% of occupancy or higher by patients for whom being in the hospital is literally a matter of life or death, essentially. So we need to activate the larger concentric circles on the outside of this system. How many patients can you detour away from the hospital via virtual medicine? Activate a hotline so that few of them arrive at the hospital, so that you give them an option that is safe, secure, easy to use. How many patients you cannot treat via phone? For those patients, detour them to a non-acute care facility, essentially a mobile clinic, a GP's office. Support those GPs so they don't refer patients to your emergency department. Once they get to the emergency department, how many of those patients can you avoid admission of, so they go straight home instead of being sent to a bed in the 4th floor in your internal medicine ward or your ICU? Because you don't have enough internal medicine beds, you don't have enough ICU beds, you don't have enough ventilators in that sense. If you reallocate the very scarce resources almost with the warlike mentality, the war analogy with COVID has been used extensively. essentially, if you figure out which patients you can treat with lower resource utilization, and every time you avoid a hospital presentation, you're utilizing fewer resources, basically, then the system becomes sustainable in the long term. If you default to admission to hospitalization, like we do, way too easily, way too frequently, then you have a collapse. The hospital doesn't just collapse operationally, it becomes another contagion vector, and it worsens the problem.
Thank you, Dan. Então, o que o Dan acabou de dividir é que, para evitar esse colapso, primeiro tem que se realizar esforços muito grandes para poder direcionar os pacientes para fora do hospital em redes complementares de assistência, seja utilizando cuidado virtual, seja utilizando locais para poder tratar esses pacientes fora do hospital. Então, quanto mais pacientes a gente conseguir retirar do ambiente hospitalar, pacientes que não necessitam ir ao hospital, mais a gente caminha na direção de evitar esse colapso. Falando dos pacientes que chegam ao hospital, ele recomenda ter protocolos bastante rigorosos para evitar internações desnecessárias e poder fazer com que os pacientes que não necessitem de internação fiquem o menor tempo possível dentro do hospital, de tal forma que a capacidade que existe, que é limitada, seja direcionada àqueles que realmente precisam de internação e que também se evite em tornar os hospitais um centro de contágio da doença. E essa reorganização é fundamental para evitar o colapso. Muito obrigado, Lilian, pela pergunta. Eu vou agora fazer uma pergunta para o Nicolas, que é o nosso analista de soluções estratégicas. Nicolas, qual que é o princípio que você acha que apresenta as maiores oportunidades de melhoria da gestão hospitalar, considerando o cenário atual?
Bom, primeiramente, muito boa tarde. Eu gostaria de destacar que muitas instituições de saúde já estão avançando em algumas das iniciativas que o Dan mostrou para a gente. Hoje nós vemos algumas instituições já utilizando atendimento virtual, a telemedicina, separando também os fluxos de atendimento entre pacientes que têm o Covid, pacientes infectados e pacientes que não são infectados. Mas o que eu gostaria de destacar é a importância de nós termos uma equipe centralizada para acelerar alguns processos. O processo que eu estou falando é de diagnóstico, de tratamentos e principalmente de alta dos pacientes. Hoje existe uma oportunidade muito grande de nós acelerarmos a alta dos pacientes através da coordenação dessas equipes multidisciplinares. Quando a gente vê, hoje no setor de aviação, as companhias aéreas, elas coordenam a partida dos voos com outras equipes, quer seja do aeroporto, quer seja de manutenção, e da mesma forma a gente tem esse potencial para as instituições de saúde. Se nós fizermos isso, você vai ver instituições de saúde conseguindo pelo menos 10% a mais de capacidade hospitalar, além de otimizar também a ocupação dos leitos.
Obrigado, Nicolas. Estava em mudo aqui. Eu queria aproveitar agora e fazer uma pergunta para o Luke. Luke, com todas essas mudanças que a gente está vivenciando, qual que vai ser o impacto do Covid-19 na média de hospitalização durante a crise?
Bom, boa tarde a todos. Acho que esse é um ponto extremamente crítico que explica uma parte de por que o sistema se coloca em colapso com o aumento do número de casos, né? Embora nós temos poucas publicações ainda em termos de qualidade dos estudos, uma vez que é tudo muito recente, os estudos publicados, eles têm sugerido uma taxa de hospitalização, por exemplo, em Wuhan média, que foi de 11 dias, e depois baixou para 10 dias do Covid-19, No Reino Unido, uma pesquisa separou um pouco o perfil do paciente, então avaliou os pacientes menos graves tratados em enfermaria com média de hospitalização de 8 dias e os pacientes mais críticos, mais frágeis, com tempo de hospitalização de 16 dias. Esse é um aspecto importante. É uma publicação também, agora recente, do New England Journal of Medicine, relacionada aos doentes da China, mostrou uma média dos pacientes que vão para ventilação mecânica na casa dos 13 dias somente de suporte de ventilação. Então, quando a gente pensa na disponibilidade de leitos, pensa num tempo de internação, em que se eu coloco na UTI somente os doentes mais graves, com longos períodos de hospitalização, essa rotatividade ou os dias leitos desse paciente, leitos-dias, perdão, é muito grande. Isso consome e leva a uma capacidade muito maior do que a demanda que vai chegando, que se torna crítico esse critério citado por você, pelo Dan, de como garantir que somente quem precise seja hospitalizado.
Perfeito, Luque. Obrigado pelas considerações. E agora eu tenho uma pergunta que eu gostaria de fazer para a Bruna. Bruna, quais das práticas mencionadas você acha que são as mais fáceis de implementar para impedir essa sobrecarga do sistema de saúde?
Obrigada, Fabrício, pela pergunta. Bom, todos os princípios hoje apresentados buscam criar esquemas que permitam um atendimento de pacientes com Covid-19 de uma maneira bem flexível e ágil. Então, enfim, evitando, assim, a sobrecarga das instituições de saúde. Eu acredito que para a implementação e adaptação desses princípios é necessário trabalhar em conjunto com diferentes setores que compõem o sistema de saúde, acelerando, assim, a tomada de decisão clínica e melhorando também o fluxo de informações com o paciente. E, claro, que sempre levando em conta a condição de saúde, idade e gravidade da evolução dos sintomas de cada um dos pacientes com Covid-19.
Obrigado, Bruna.
Obrigada.
E agora eu queria fazer mais uma pergunta para o Dan, se ele puder retornar, por favor. Então, a pergunta que eu vou fazer para o Dan é a respeito de uma causa bastante controversa, que é o gerenciamento remoto. O gerenciamento remoto não é apenas uma orientação médica, em vez de um atendimento hospitalar. A aplicação do gerenciamento remoto não invalidaria a natureza de um hospital ou clínica. So Dan, the question is the following, regarding remote management. This is not only a medical device instead of a hospital fulfillment. So going towards remote management, wouldn't we invalidate the nature of a hospital or of a clinic?
Yeah, that's a question we have heard in pretty much every single language our members speak worldwide. It's a common concern. I would say if we continue thinking that the hospital is the hospital's physical location, if we continue associating hospital with building, with those four walls, essentially, then our healthcare system is already in problems and trouble, regardless of whether we have COVID-19 or not. Essentially, we reimagine and we suggest, we recommend our members reimagine the hospital as something that provides a series of services to patients, regardless of physical location. Quite frankly, the idea that remote management goes against the nature of the hospital is something that we disagree with. We believe essentially that the hospital has to guarantee the best possible care for as many patients as possible. And quite frankly, we don't see a single health system anywhere in the world that has the financial capability to build enough beds to absorb the explosion in demand that we see over the horizon, even without a pandemic like this one, right? So every single country in the world is aging. And when you have a significant patient population over the age of 65, idosos, in Brazil, essentially they become super consumers of healthcare. And you cannot solve that problem by building more hospitals or by adding more beds. Moving them to remote management and enabling them to self-care, exploiting outpatient models is the sustainability solution with a pandemic in urgent terms in the short term, and without a pandemic for the longer term. And that would enable the hospital to have readily available beds for patients that absolutely positively need to be treated in that physical setting. We have run projections that go all the way to the year 2050. Between now and 2050, more than 1/3 of the growth in expenditures in healthcare can be regressed statistically, can be linked with the kind of patient that needs the type of treatment that can only be delivered in an acute care hospital, in a high complexity tertiary hospital. We don't see any health system, public or private, in Scandinavia or in Brazil, urban or rural, that can create enough extra beds, enough new beds to meet that demand, which means that if we don't move to remote management, those patients that don't absolutely need to be with us occupying a bed, we're doing a disservice to two patient populations. Moreover, there are some patients for whom admission into the hospital is in and of itself detrimental to the model of care. Elderly patients, frail and elderly patients over the age of 65 lose the capability to live independently every day they spend hospitalized in an acute care bed. The United Kingdom, the NHS, delivered a research study 2 years ago. For every day a person over the age of 65 spends in a hospital bed, he or she loses between 1% and 4% of muscle mass. The average length of stay for an elderly patient in a British hospital is 11 days. You multiply 11 days times a 2-3% muscle mass loss for every single day. That person is no longer capable of going back home and living an independent life. By choosing to hospitalize them, we have essentially condemned them to live the rest of their life in dependency, right? So even if we had the beds, which we don't, but even if we had them, we shouldn't use them as the default. The new nature of the hospital is to provide care independently, regardless of physical location, independently of geography.
Thank you a lot, Dan. Então, o Dan trouxe a seguinte reflexão. Ainda que estejamos vivendo nos dias de hoje esta total falta de leitos por conta da Covid-19, no longo prazo a situação vai ser bastante parecida, com o aumento da demanda que vai vir da população idosa e todos os serviços que a gente vai ter que entregar. E a única forma de resolver essa questão é quebrar o modelo mental de que os serviços de hospital têm que ser entregues dentro de 4 paredes e abraçar o conceito de gestão remota e que os serviços hospitalares têm que ir além das suas instalações físicas. Finalmente, ele trouxe que, além da questão de total falta de leitos para demanda que vai vir, ou que a gente está enfrentando agora com o Covid-19, ainda tem a questão de que cada dia que o idoso passa no leito, segundo uma pesquisa feita no Reino Unido, ele perde 2 a 3% da sua massa magra. Portanto, depois de 10 dias, ele volta com bastante dificuldade de levar uma vida normal se fica internado durante tanto tempo. Então, muito obrigado, Dan, muito obrigado a todos os panelistas. E, para encerrar, eu gostaria de convidar ao Gustavo Gala para enviar uma mensagem de encerramento a todos que nos prestigiaram no dia de hoje. Muito obrigado da minha parte. Por favor, Gustavo.
Obrigado, Fabricio. Espero que este webinar tenha sido útil para você. Também quero agradecer aos meus colegas de Johnson & Johnson, Bruna, Carla, Nicolás, Luque, Fabricio, e a nossos parceiros de Distrito e da Advisory Board. Obrigado, Daniel. Quiero agradecer especialmente a los profesionales de salud que participaron de esta sesión. E que hoje são os héroes que estão salvando a vida dos pacientes com Covid. Muito obrigado. Fique seguro e tchau.